Sorry, my internet dropped. Let's continue. I think I remember where it ended. So this is exactly what healthy messengers do. They do not worship the method. They serve the purpose. The purpose is help this person reach an encounter with truth. If the doorway works, use it. If doorway is inaccessible, find another way. This protects us. This also protects truth from becoming a rigid formula. Sometimes we discover one method that helped us and conclude, everyone must awaken exactly the way I did. But that turns our experience into another gatekeeping structure. Someone may awaken through scripture, another through suffering, another through therapy, another through a conversation, another through observing a healthy relationship for the first time, another through realizing that the beliefs they inherited no longer produce coherent fruit. Different routes, same invitation toward truth. They uncovered the roof where he was. Notice their action is targeted. They do not destroy the whole house. That is important. They identify the specific barrier that must be opened. This can give us a very mature picture of reform. Awakening does not always require destroying everything. Sometimes, people awaken to one harmful structure and conclude, everything connected with this environment must be false. That can become men as street perception again. But these friends do not burn down the house because the door is blocked. They create an opening where an opening is needed. That is discernment. You can challenge a structure without rejecting everything inside it. A family may have harmful communication patterns. That doesn't necessarily mean there was never love. A religious community may carry an interpretation that produces fear. That does not mean every person in it has malicious intent. A workplace may have a poor management system. That does not mean every employee is corrupt. Clear sight identifies what specifically needs opening. That is more precise than destroy everything. The roof is a covering. Something that was covered becomes opened. That is very awakening-like. Conditioning often functions as a covering over perception, assumptions, inherited categories, and questioned beliefs. Statements such as, that is just how things are. Then someone asks, but does it have to be? A roof begins opening. Sometimes you need to question the structure above you. What has been governing your thinking? What assumptions have been sitting over your consciousness? A good child never disagrees with a parent. Is that true? Open the roof. Love means giving someone unlimited access. Is that true? Open the roof. Forgiveness means returning to the same harmful situation. Is that true? Open the roof. Authority means never being questioned. Is that true? Open the roof. Sometimes, truth becomes accessible when inherited coverings are examined. Next, and when they had broken it up. This is stronger. They do not merely look at the roof, they actually alter the structure. That matters because insight without action may leave access unchanged. Sometimes we know a barrier exists, but refuse to change anything. A workplace knows its process excludes people, but that's how we've always done it. A family knows everyone is afraid of one person's anger, but just keep the peace. A community knows people cannot ask questions safely, but we cannot change the culture. Then observation has occurred without transformation. The friends do something different. They act on what they see. If the structure prevents life, the structure may need to change. That is an important principle. Structures exist to serve people. People should not always be sacrificed to preserve structures. Rules can have value. Traditions can have value. Institutions can have value. But if preserving the structure requires keeping someone permanently outside access to truth, healing, dignity, or participation, then perhaps the structure needs examination. This is not recklessness. Again, we should keep the balance. Not every barrier should simply be broken impulsively. Some boundaries protect life. Remember our cherubim function, guarding what is sacred. So mature discernment asks, is this boundary protecting life? Or is this barrier merely preventing access? That distinction is crucial. A healthy boundary and a blocked door are not the same thing. A boundary may say, you cannot abuse people in this environment. That protects life. A blocked door may say, you cannot ask questions here. That may protect control rather than truth. We examine the fruit. The friends are not breaking a protective boundary around truth. They are overcoming an accessibility problem. That is important. Their action moves someone toward restoration, agency, and life. That fruit tells us something about the function. They let down the bed. Now notice how carefully they handle the man. They do not throw him through the opening. They let him down. There is support throughout the transition. That is beautiful. Creating access is not enough. You also have to help someone navigate the transition safely. Imagine helping someone leave a controlling relationship and saying, okay, you are free now, good luck. That may not be enough. They may need safety planning, housing, financial support, counseling, time, and emotional support. You opened the roof, now help them down. Sometimes, awakening is disorienting. A person's whole worldview may be changing. They may realize what I called love was control. That is freeing, but also painful. What I thought was my identity was conditioning, freeing, and disorienting. The belief system I depended upon no longer makes sense to me, freeing and frightening. So, healthy messengers do not simply rip open someone's worldview and then abandon them. They help them descend carefully into the encounter. This is why how we share truth matters. Someone may see something clearly and want everyone else to see it immediately. But if we tear apart another person's framework without compassion, we can destabilize them unnecessarily. Truth should liberate, not merely shock. The friends are persistent without becoming violent toward their friend. That distinction is beautiful. They are determined. Healthy help can be strong without becoming coercive. They let down the bed wearing the sick of the porcelain. Notice that the bed comes with him. This is important. The theme associated with his condition enters the encounter too. Nothing is hidden. He does not have to pretend, I am already walking. His limitation comes into the presence of truth exactly as it is. That is beautiful. You do not have to pretend to be healed before encountering truth. You can bring the fear, the shame, the confusion, the paralysis, the questions, the bed. Truth does not require you to hide the condition in order to become acceptable. The condition can be seen. Then restoration can address what is actually present. Healthy environments allow people to arrive with their bed. That is a powerful image. Not fix yourself before coming, but come as you are and let us see what truth reveals. That does not mean remaining forever as we came, because the story ends with transformation. But admission is not contingent upon already being transformed. That is compassionate. He is lowered in front of Jesus. And now the friends have done essentially everything they can do. This is important. They carried. They navigated the crowd. They opened the roof. They lowered him. Now, they cannot take the next step for him. The encounter has arrived. There is a point where the helper must stop. That is one of the hardest parts of healthy support. You help someone reach truth. Then you release control over what they do with it. You cannot force recognition, decision, healing, or embodiment. The friends cannot say, now respond exactly the way we expect. They have brought him. Now the encounter belongs to him. This is where agency must be preserved. Sometimes, helpers become frustrated. After everything I did for you, why aren't you doing what I told you? But then the help has become ownership. Healthy assistance says, I helped because I love you. Your life still belongs to you. That is a much healthier messenger function. They do not stand between him and Jesus. That is crucial. They bring him near enough that the mediator role becomes unnecessary. Then they get out of the center. That is what healthy spiritual teachers should do. A healthy teacher eventually becomes less necessary. Not because the teacher has no value, but because the student begins encountering truth directly. At first, what does this symbol mean? Later, wait, I think I see the pattern. That is growth. The roof opening worked. And that is how we know the help is healthy. The helper's success will eventually look like the person no longer needing to be carried. That is beautiful. There is another important insight here. The friends have not yet heard Jesus say, "Arise." But their behavior already assumes that paralysis does not have to be permanent. That is faith as action. They see a condition, but they act toward possibility. Faith does not reduce the person to what is visible right now. They could have said, "He cannot walk." That's simply his reality. Instead, let's bring him. They do not deny the paralysis. They simply refuse to treat paralysis as the only possible future. That is healthy hope. Next, they broke it up. This gives us another beautiful principle for awakening. Sometimes, helping someone reach truth requires challenging the very structures that once seemed untouchable. Not because distraction is the goal. Access is. Life is. Restoration is. Agency is. That determines how and why the structure is being challenged. Think about generational patterns. Someone says, "In our family, children do not question parents." One generation decides, "My children can respectfully tell me when I heard them." Roof opened. The family still exists. Respect still exists. But the structure changes. Why? To create access to honesty and repair. Think about relationships. Old structure. If you love me, you tell me everything, and I have access to everything. New understanding. Love includes trust and personal boundaries. Roof opened. Relationship does not have to be destroyed. The controlling structure is being dismantled. Think about teaching scripture. Old structure. You must accept the interpretation before asking whether it is coherent. New structure. Let's observe the text first. Roof opened. Scripture remains, but the method of engagement changes. Now people can encounter the text for themselves. Verse 5. When Jesus saw their faith, he said unto the sick of the palsy, "Son, thy sins be forgiven thee." This verse is remarkable because Jesus does not begin with the man's legs. Everyone can see the paralysis. That is the obvious condition. The friends have gone through all this effort because the man cannot walk. They carried him, opened the roof, lowered him down, and yet, when embodied truth encounters him, the first words are not "move your legs." The first word is "son," and then "thy sins be forgiven thee." So before movement is restored, Something happens at the level of identity, release, inner government. That is huge. When Jesus saw their faith, notice again their faith, not many demands. The friend's faith has become visible through action. They believed enough impossibility to carry him, navigate the obstacle, climb the roof, open the structure, lower him into the encounter. Their faith became embodied. This is not merely we believe something good could happen. Their bodies participated in what they believed. Faith becomes visible through movement. That fits everything we have been observing. Faith is not merely something someone claims inwardly. It produces fruit. These friends saw a condition and responded. This does not have to be the final word. That belief gave them movement before their friend had movement. That is beautiful. Sometimes a community can hold possibility for you while you are temporarily unable to hold it for yourself. There are seasons when someone may be so exhausted, ashamed, afraid, conditioned, and overwhelmed that they cannot imagine another possibility. Then healthy people around them say, "We still see you. We still believe movement is possible. We will help you reach support." They are not taking ownership of your life. They are lending strength to possibility. But notice what happens once the man reaches Jesus. Jesus speaks to the man. The friends carried him into the encounter. But now, the conversation becomes direct. That is important. The friends' role decreases once access has been created. Again, healthy support does not remain unnecessarily in the middle. They do not answer for him. They do not say, "Jesus, here's what he needs." They do not interpret his entire life for him. They brought him. Now truth addresses him personally. That preserves agency. Next, he said unto the sick of the palsy. Mark identifies the condition. But Jesus immediately speaks something deeper than the condition. And this gives us another important distinction. Truth sees the condition without confusing the condition with the person. The man has paralysis, but paralysis is not his identity. And Jesus' first word makes that clear. Son. This may be one of the most beautiful details in the whole passage. Before healing, movement, correction, and anything else, Jesus addresses him relationally. He says, "Son." He does not begin paralytic, sinner, problem, broken person. He begins with identity. Truth names the person before addressing the condition. That is powerful. Before rise comes son. Before action is restored, identity is established. And that is because healthy transformation cannot be built on self-hatred. Imagine how different these two approaches are. One approach says, "You are a failure, now fix yourself." Another says, "You belong, Now let us address what is keeping you from moving. Very different government. The first may produce shame. The second creates a foundation for restoration. Sun restores relationship before movement. There is another layer. The man has been carried in because something about his life is immobilized. And the first thing embodied truth gives him is not performance, it is belonging. That is significant. Sometimes people have been conditioned to believe, I become worthy after I perform correctly. But here, belonging precedes the command to move. Sun, then rise. Identity before action. Healthy parenting works like this too. A child makes a mistake. Healthy correction communicates, what you did was wrong. Without you are worthless. The relationship remains stable while behavior is addressed. That teaches responsibility without destroying identity. Healthy leadership does the same. An employee makes an error. A mature leader can say, this process failed, let's correct it. Without you are incompetent. Again, condition, not identity. Then Jesus says, thy sins be forgiven thee. And this is where we need to slow down. Because if paralysis symbolically represents blocked movement or impaired agency, why does Jesus address sin before movement? That is the question. First, we should not assume the physical paralysis was a punishment for sin. That would go beyond what this verse actually establishes. Jesus does not say, you are paralyzed because you sinned. So within our symbolic reading, we do not need to create that casual accusation. Instead, we can observe the sequence. The visible problem is immobility. But Jesus first addresses an inner burden of misalignment, guilt, debt, condemnation, or separation. Then later, he restores movement. That sequence itself is meaningful. What is sin within our awakening framework? We have been treating sin not merely as a list of forbidden behaviors, but more deeply as misalignment. Movement away from truth, love, integrity, compassion, responsibility, life, the source. It is missing the mark of the nature we were meant to express. And misalignment can produce consequences. But forgiveness means misalignment does not have to become permanent identity. Forgiving means the past does not have to remain the governing debt. That is powerful. Something can be acknowledged without being eternally held over the person's head. Forgiveness does not mean nothing happened. It means what happened does not have to remain the permanent ruler of what comes next. That fits beautifully with everything we have said about forgiveness. Perhaps the man needs release before movement. Imagine someone who has lived for years saying, I ruined everything. I cannot forgive myself. Because of what I did, I do not deserve another life. I can never recover from who I used to be. Even if an opportunity to move appears, shame may keep them lying on the bed. That is paralysis of consciousness. Shame can immobilize. This is incredibly relatable. A person makes a mistake 10 years ago. They have apologized. They have learned. They have changed. Yet internally, they still say, I am that mistake. Now the past continues carrying them. The bed remains under them. Truth may need to say, you can be released before they can hear rise. Guilt and shame are not the same thing. This distinction matters. Healthy guilt can say, I did something wrong. I need to repair it. That can produce responsibility. Shame says, I am fundamentally unworthy and should remain condemned. That can immobilize. Truth can preserve accountability while releasing condemnation. Forgiveness does not remove responsibility. If I harmed someone, forgiveness does not mean, therefore, I never need to apologize. No. Alignment may require acknowledgement, repair, restitution where possible, changed behavior. But after responsibility is taken, permanent self-condemnation serves no restorative purpose. The source is restorative. So the movement becomes see clearly, take responsibility, repair, learn, then walk. This is why thy sins be forgiven thee can be liberating. The man may have been carrying more than his body. He may symbolically represent consciousness carrying condemnation, inherited guilt, fear, misalignment, the belief I cannot move beyond this. An embodied truth says release. The debt does not need to govern the future. Notice that forgiveness comes before proof. This is another beautiful observation. Jesus does not say, walk first, then I will forgive you. That would make restoration conditional upon performance. Instead, thy sins be forgiven thee. Then later arise. Release precedes movement. That is profound. Sometimes we think we must fix ourselves before we deserve restoration. Once I become better, then I can forgive myself. Once everyone approves of me again, then I can move forward. Once I undo everything I did, then I can have peace. But some things cannot be undone. They can only be acknowledged, repaired where possible, learned from, released, then embodied differently. The past cannot always be rewritten, but the future can be governed differently. That is forgiveness as restoration. You cannot go backward and become someone who never made the mistake. But you can become someone who has seen it, owned it, learned from it, changed, and now walks differently. That is meaningful transformation. Son before sin. The order is beautiful. Jesus does not say, sinner, maybe you can become son. He says, son, thy sins be forgiven thee. Identity contains the condition. The condition does not contain the identity. That is a huge distinction. This connects with remember your origin. If the source is truth, love, compassion, integrity, and life, then awakening is remembering the nature from which consciousness should be governed. Sin is where expression becomes misaligned from that nature. Forgiveness restores the possibility of alignment, then embodiment follows. So the sequence may be identity remembered, son. Misalignment released, thy sins be forgiven thee. Agency restored, arise. Former limitation brought under new government, take up thy bed. Embodiment begins, walk. That is an astonishing awakening map. And notice the friends cannot give him this. They can carry him. They can open the roof. They can create access. But they cannot forgive his inner burden for him. They cannot restore his identity internally. They cannot make him rise. That belongs to his encounter with truth. Again, the friends have limits. Healthy messengers understand limits. You cannot do another person's inner work. You can tell them, you don't have to keep condemning yourself. But they eventually must encounter that truth. You can say, you deserve better, but they must eventually embody the boundary. You can say, you are allowed to speak, but eventually they must use their voice. You can carry them to the threshold, but you cannot walk their walk. That makes the friend's role even more beautiful. They do exactly enough. Not nothing, not everything, enough to create encounter. That is mature help. When Jesus saw their faith, there is also a communal dimension to restoration here. Sometimes, another person's belief in our capacity creates enough space for us to begin seeing ourselves differently. Someone says, I know this is not who you have to remain. That can be life-changing. But healthy faith in another person is not I will force you to change. It is I will make room for the possibility of your restoration. The friends see possibility. Jesus speaks identity. And soon, the man will embody movement. Look at that sequence. Community says, there is more possible. Truth says, son. Release says, forgiving. Then agency will hear, rise. That is restoration, unfolding layer by layer. Sometimes, the visible problem is the last layer. A person says, I cannot leave. The visible problem, staying. But underneath, fear, shame, dependency, conditioning, belief about worth, and threat. That is why simply telling someone, just leave, may not restore movement. Something deeper may need touching first. Or, why won't they speak up? Maybe because inside is, if I speak, I will lose love. Now we have the deeper paralysis. Truth must address the inner government. Then movement becomes possible. This is what makes the Jesus office different from mere command. It does not simply shout, get up. It first sees the deeper human condition, identity, burden, misalignment, then movement. That is compassionate restoration. Verse 6. But there were 7 of the scribes sitting there and reasoning in their hearts. Now the story introduces another kind of consciousness. The friends have just used effort, persistence, and creative thinking to help someone reach truth. The scribes are also thinking, but their reasoning serves a very different function. That distinction matters. Because reasoning itself is not the problem. The question is, what is reasoning serving? Is it serving truth or protecting an inherited conclusion? The scribes represent people associated with interpretation, preservation, and understanding of the text. So these are not people with no knowledge. They know scripture. They know language. They know doctrine. They know established categories. And yet knowledge alone does not guarantee clear perception. That is important. You can know a text deeply and still interpret a new manifestation of truth through an old framework. Knowledge can help us see, but it can also become the structure through which we refuse to see. That is the danger. If I use knowledge to ask, what is happening here? That is healthy. If I use knowledge only to prove, what I already believe cannot be questioned, then reasoning has become defensive. Sitting there, this detail is interesting. The paralytic came in unable to move. The friends are active. Jesus is speaking, but the scribes are sitting. Some people are moving toward restoration. Others are stationary, observing and reasoning. That can happen in awakening. One person is undergoing transformation. Another person is busy analyzing whether the transformation fits their categories. You can watch someone become free and still be more concerned with whether their freedom fits your doctrine. That is powerful. Someone says, I finally learned I can have boundaries. Instead of asking, what fruit is this producing? Someone responds, but that is not how our family does things. The old framework becomes more important than the restored agency. Next, reasoning in their hearts. Now we get the location of the reasoning inside. They are not yet speaking publicly. They are interpreting inwardly. That tells us something important about consciousness. Before outward accusation comes inner interpretation. The external response often begins with an internal narrative. Thoughts become the seed of response. Someone says something, then inwardly we interpret, they are disrespecting me. That interpretation shapes anger. Another person says the exact same thing. We interpret. They are asking a reasonable question. Different response. So the inner reasoning matters. Reasoning is not the enemy. We need to say this clearly. Our whole approach depends on observation and reasoning. We ask context, pattern, language, fruit, and coherence. So the message cannot be do not think. It is examine what your thinking is serving. Healthy reasoning is curious. It says, that is interesting. How does this fit? What does the larger pattern show? Am I missing context? What fruit follows? Could my previous interpretation need refinement? That is open reasoning. Defensive reasoning begins with the conclusion. It says, this cannot be true. Then searches for evidence to defend the conclusion. That is very different. One uses reasoning to discover. The other uses reasoning to protect. This is the serpent's function in its misaligned form. Within our established symbolic framework, the serpent represents reasoning or analytical consciousness. Reasoning is not inherently evil. It can be wise. It can discern. It can investigate. But it can also become deceptive when it begins twisting observation in order to preserve ego, fear, or inherited assumptions. That is what we need to watch here. The same faculty can serve truth or defend illusion. A knife can prepare food or harm someone. The tool itself is not the whole issue. Reasoning can uncover truth or rationalize control. For example, a controlling partner says, I check your phone because I love you. Reasoning has been recruited to justify control. A parent says, I shame my children so that they'll become strong. Reasoning protects the harmful pattern. A spiritual leader says, people need me to make every decision because they are not mature enough. Reasoning protects dependency. The mind can build sophisticated arguments around misalignment. The scribes have knowledge, but the question is whether their knowledge can still be taught. That is the awakening issue. If knowledge becomes identity, correction feels like threat. Because then, if my interpretation changes, who am I? So consciousness begins protecting itself. This is why humility matters in teaching. The more we know, the more important it becomes to remain able to say, I may need another touch. That is Mark 8 again. Partial sight can still happen in highly educated consciousness. You can have scripture and still see men as trees. You can know every verse and still reduce people to categories. Still misfunction. Still confuse title with fruit. Knowledge does not automatically equal clear sight. The scribes are about to question Jesus' authority to forgive. That tells us what is happening internally. They are not yet asking, what does this release mean for the man? They are focused on whether Jesus is permitted to say it. That is a very institutional concern. Institutions often ask, who authorized you? Before asking, is this producing life? That can be necessary sometimes. Authority and accountability do matter. But if the question of authority becomes detached from fruit, systems can end up resisting restoration simply because it did not come through the expected channel. The paralytic is lying there. Imagine the contrast. One consciousness sees a person needing restoration. Another sees a theological problem. That is important. The Jesus office keeps the person at the center. He sees the man, the condition, the burden, the possibility. The scribes are about to center the category. That contrast matters. One asks, how do we help this person encounter life? The other asks, does this fit our authorized framework? Both questions can have value. But when the second blocks the first entirely, the structure may be protecting itself rather than serving life. Reasoning in their hearts. This also tells us that hidden reasoning eventually becomes visible. Jesus will address it. That is another awakening principle. What is hidden inside eventually produces fruit. Fear, judgment, compassion, control. Whatever governs inwardly will eventually reveal itself outwardly. This is why inner work matters. We can manage appearances for a while. But if inwardly we are constantly resentful, fearful, controlling, and defensive, that will eventually show. The heart is the workshop before behavior becomes visible. Reasoning can be a messenger too. An insight arises inside. Wait, something does not fit. That can be valuable. Not every internal objection is wrong. Sometimes the reasoning faculty is protecting us from deception. So again, we do not automatically condemn the scribes simply for questioning. The real issue will be what they do with the question. Mark 2:7. Why does this man thus speak blasphemies? Who can forgive sins but God only? This verse is fascinating because the scribes actually begin with a principle that on the surface sounds reasonable. Who can forgive sins but God only? If God represents the source, truth, love, compassion, integrity, life, restoration, then yes, ultimate restoration belongs to the nature of the source. But notice what happens. They move from forgiveness comes from God to therefore, this man cannot possibly speak forgiveness. And that second conclusion does not necessarily follow. That is where their reason becomes restrictive. They have confused the source with the channel through which the source can be expressed. And within our framework of Jesus as an office of embodied truth, that distinction becomes extremely important. Why does this man? Notice how they refer to Jesus, this man. They see the human vessel, but they have not yet recognized the function being expressed through the vessel. That connects directly with everything we have been learning about offices. A person can occupy a messenger office, a guardian office, a clarifying office, a restorative office. The human being does not become the source simply because source-aligned truth is expressed through them. The vessel carries the principle. The vessel is not the origin of the principle. This is exactly what we established with messengers. If someone brings you a message aligned with truth, the messenger does not become truth's origin. A friend might say, you are allowed to leave a situation that is harming you. The friend did not invent dignity. They carried a message aligned with it. A counselor might help someone realize what happened to you does not have to define your entire identity. The counselor did not invent restoration. They help make restoration understandable. A teacher may explain a principle that opens someone's eyes. The teacher did not become the source. They carried something. That is messenger consciousness. So God only and human expression do not have to contradict each other. This is the key. If the source is love, can a human express love? Of course. If the source is truth, can a human speak truth? Yes. If the source is compassion, can compassion become visible through human hands? Yes. If the source is forgiveness and restoration, can a human being embody and announce that restorative principle? Why would that automatically be impossible? That seems to be the category the scribes have not yet considered. They may be protecting the source so rigidly that they cannot recognize the source being expressed. That is an interesting irony. Their concern seems to be, you cannot give to a man what belongs to God. But if the purpose of the sun is to make the invisible nature visible, then the very thing they are resisting may be the nature of the source becoming visible through human expression. That is powerful. Why does this man thus speak? The problem then is not simply that they disagree. It is that they already possess a category for what God is allowed to look like. And Jesus does not fit the category. That happens in awakening constantly. We say, truth must look like this. Then truth appears through a route we did not expect. And instead of examining the fruit, we reject the root. Someone may expect help to look religious. Then a therapist becomes the messenger who helps them regain agency. They miss it because that is not how I expected God to help. Someone expects wisdom to come from an older person. Then their child says something that exposes the truth. They miss it because the vessel looks wrong. Someone expects the messenger to carry a title, but clarity comes through an ordinary friend. Again, the vessel does not match the expected category. That is why we established the fruit test. Do not ask only who is speaking. Ask what is being expressed. Does the message produce clarity, truth, responsibility, compassion, agency, restoration, or fear, control, dependency, ego, confusion? The office is recognized by function. Next, blasphemies. Now notice how quickly their reasoning produces a label. They do not say, this is unusual. They do not say, we need to understand what he means. They say, blasphemies. The conclusion has arrived before the observable fruit has fully unfolded. That is exactly the danger we just identified. Labels can stop observation. Once I label something dangerous, I may stop examining it. Once I label someone rebellious, I may stop listening to the question. Once I label a boundary selfish, I may never ask whether the previous relationship was exploitative. Once I label an interpretation blasphemy, I may never observe whether it produces restoration, coherence, and life. Labels can become conclusions that close perception. This does not mean every accusation of harm is wrong. Again, balance matters. Sometimes, something truly is manipulative, abusive, dishonest, dangerous. Those things should be named accurately. The issue is not never label anything. The issue is, do not let the label arrive before careful observation. That is our recurring principle. Observe before you conclude. Listen to the teaching fully before you start attacking, before you start becoming disrespectful. Listen to the teaching fully. The scribes have heard one sentence, thy sins be forgiven thee, and already blasphemy. But the story is not over. The man has not even risen yet. They have not yet seen the full fruit. That is premature conclusion. This is men as streets again. They are seeing Jesus through a category. They know man, God, forgiveness, authority. And the categories have become rigid enough that they cannot yet see the function occurring before them. It is another form of partial perception. They see the structure, but not yet the full person or office. Next, who can forgive sins but God only? Now let us honor the legitimate insight underneath their question. They are trying to protect the idea that forgiveness ultimately belongs to God. Within our framework, we can agree with that principle while making a distinction. The source remains the source. Jesus does not have to replace the source in order to express the source. That is the Son pattern. The Son expresses, the source originates. That distinction protects us from turning the Jesus office into ego. Someone occupying the Jesus office should never say, "Truth belongs to me," or "You can only reach the source through my personality." No. The office is recognized because the person is embodying a nature greater than their ego. This is why Jesus as an office must remain humble. The moment someone says, "Because I embody truth, I am now the source of truth," the office has been distorted. No, you reflect, you carry, you express, you embody, but the source remains thrown. That protects both the messenger and the person receiving the message. Forgiveness can be carried without being owned. This is such an important distinction. A friend may tell you, "I forgive you." That is a human expression of forgiveness. A parent may release a child from constant condemnation after genuine repair. A community may restore someone after accountability and change. Humans clearly participate in forgiveness relationally. So the deeper symbolic question is not, can a human utter forgiveness? The question is, what nature is being expressed through the act? When Jesus says, "Thy sins be forgiven thee," within this reading, he is not saying, "I am an ego, personally deciding whether you deserve existence." He is expressing the restorative principle of the source. The man is being released from a condition that should not govern his future. That is fruit aligned with life, restoration, and agency. Remember what comes next. This forgiveness does not produce dependence. It produces rise. That tells us a lot. If Jesus' forgiveness resulted in, "Now stay helpless before me forever," we would need to question the function. Instead, release leads toward agency. That is source-aligned fruit. The man is not being forgiven into passivity. He is being released toward movement. That is incredibly important. Forgiveness is not nothing matters. It is the past will not remain the chain preventing the next aligned action. Then rise, carry, and walk. That is restorative forgiveness. This is why shame-based systems often resist forgiveness. Because shame can be a powerful tool of control. If I can keep reminding you, remember what you did, remember what you were, you owe us, then I can keep you immobilized. But forgiveness can break that leverage. It says, take responsibility, repair what can be repaired, learn, then move. A system built on permanent condemnation may find that threatening. Imagine someone who made a serious mistake years ago. They acknowledge it, apologize, repair what can be repaired, change their behavior. But every family disagreement still becomes, remember what you did 10 years ago. Now the past is being used as a bed they are never allowed to rise from. Truth may say, that was real. Accountability mattered, but it is not the throne of your identity forever. That is forgiveness. Or someone who once had no boundaries. They allowed people to use them. Now they are waking. But every time they begin changing, someone says, you used to be fine with this. Forgiveness of the former self may be necessary. Yes, I allowed it before. Now I see differently. And I am allowed to move differently. Rise. The scribes are focused on who has permission to release. Jesus is focused on whether the man can be restored. That contrast is striking. One consciousness says, who authorized this? The other is restoring movement. Again, authority matters, but the fruit cannot be ignored. This happens in institutions. Someone develops an unconventional solution that helps people. The first question becomes, who approved this? Sometimes that is necessary. But sometimes the institutional concern becomes so dominant that nobody asks, is this actually restoring people? Clear discernment needs both order and fruit. The friends broke through the roof. Now the scribes are defending the ceiling. Symbolically, that contrast is almost perfect. The friends saw a structure blocking access and opened it. The scribes hear a restorative word and immediately try to place it back inside an established boundary. Only God can do that. Their concern is with protecting the category. The friend's concern was getting the person to truth. Again, two uses of consciousness. One form of reasoning creates access. Another can restrict access. The friends reasoned, the door is blocked. Let's find another way. The scribes reasoned, this does not fit our category. Therefore, it must be wrong. Same faculty, different fruit. That is why reasoning itself cannot be the final judge. We examine what governs the reasoning. This means anyone occupying the Jesus office must reflect the same fruit, not just speak religious language. If someone claims to embody Christ consciousness, but consistently produces shame, control, dependence, fear, ego worship, silencing, then the fruit contradicts the office. But where we see truth, compassion, restoration, responsibility, agency, and clear sight, then we can observe a source-aligned function being expressed. And no one needs to become the source. This keeps our framework grounded. The mother protecting her child, can occupy a guardian function. The doctor bringing a life-preserving message can occupy messenger function. The counselor clarifying confusion can occupy a Gabriel-like function. The mature mentor strengthening someone through resistance can occupy a Michael-like function. And the person embodying restorative truth can occupy a Jesus-like function. Different vessels, source remains throne. Who can forgive sins but God only? So perhaps the scribes have one part of the pattern. Forgiveness belongs to the source, but they have not yet understood the next part. The nature of the source can become visible through human embodiment. That is the gap. And this is exactly what awakening often does. It does not always throw away the old insight. Sometimes it expands it. Mature awakening can say, what I understood before was not completely wrong. It was incomplete. That is important. We do not have to turn every previous belief into I was stupid. No. Maybe we saw men as trees. There was something real in the perception. We simply needed another touch. The scribes may need another touch. They know God, forgiveness, sin, authority, but they have not yet connected source, expression, embodiment, and fruit. Their categories need expanding. That is what Jesus is about to challenge. Mark 2:8. And immediately, when Jesus perceived in his spirit that they so reasoned within themselves, he said unto them, why reason ye these things in your hearts? Now the story turns inward again. The scribes have not spoken their objection aloud. They are reasoning within themselves. And Jesus addresses the hidden process before it becomes outward accusation. That is important because this entire passage is showing us that restoration is not only about what is visible. The paralytic's visible condition was paralysis, but Jesus addressed something deeper first, forgiveness. The scribe's visible condition is very different. They are physically sitting upright. They can walk. They can speak. They know scripture. But now, the text exposes another kind of obstruction. Reasoning that has become closed around an inherited conclusion. So the man on the bed is not the only consciousness in the room requiring restoration. Immediately, again, Mark emphasizes immediacy. Jesus does not let the inner reasoning develop unchecked for long. He perceives what is happening and brings it into the light. That itself is an awakening pattern. Sometimes, transformation begins when something hidden becomes visible enough to examine. Not necessarily hidden from other people, hidden from our own awareness. We can be reasoning without realizing what is governing the reasoning. That happens constantly. We think, I am simply being logical, but underneath the reasoning may be fear, ego, defensiveness, shame, need for control, blind loyalty, and a desire to protect an inherited identity. The reasoning itself may be sophisticated, But what is governing it? That is the deeper question. Jesus does not merely answer their argument. He questions the process producing the argument. He asks, why reason ye these things in your hearts? Not only your conclusion is wrong, but why is your consciousness moving in this direction? That is deeper. Next, perceived in his spirit. Within our symbolic framework, spirit points us toward the deeper governing awareness aligned with source. So Jesus is not merely reacting to surface words. He perceives the inner function operating beneath the surface. That is discernment. And this becomes very important in human relationships. Mature discernment does not only hear words, it observes the government behind them. Someone says, I just want what's best for you. Maybe that is love. Maybe it is control. We look at fruit. Someone says, I'm only asking questions. Maybe that is genuine inquiry. Maybe the questions are being used to undermine, shame, or trap. We observe function. Someone says, I'm concerned. Maybe concern is compassionate. Maybe fear is trying to govern somebody else. Again, what is operating beneath the words? This is why fruit matters more than vocabulary. People can use beautiful words while expressing harmful government. Love, respect, faith, protection, truth, all can be used sincerely. All can also be used to disguise control. So discernment must look beneath the label. Jesus perceives their reasoning before it becomes speech. That tells us something important. Inner patterns matter before they become outward behavior. If I repeatedly entertain resentment, eventually, it will influence how I interpret the person. If I repeatedly rehearse suspicion, eventually, neutral behavior may look threatening. If I repeatedly tell myself, nobody respects me, eventually, almost every disagreement may feel like disrespect. The heart becomes a workshop. Thoughts become lenses, and lenses affect perfection. That is why awakening includes examining the inner narrative. What am I repeatedly telling myself? What assumptions am I carrying? What conclusions do I automatically reach? Those things shape what I see. That they so reason within themselves. Notice again that reasoning itself is not condemned. The issue is so reasoned. This particular reasoning has taken them toward accusation before full observation. They heard forgiveness. They concluded blasphemy. The fruit of the reasoning is already visible, so Jesus challenges it. Healthy reasoning should be able to be questioned. This is critical. If my reasoning cannot tolerate examination, then it may have become identity. A healthy mind can say, let me test that. Maybe I missed something. What evidence would change my view? That is openness. But defensive reasoning says, if you question my conclusion, you are attacking me. That is different. Jesus asked why. That question itself creates space. Why? Why did you interpret it that way? Why did you assume the worst? Why did you immediately call it blasphemy? Why did you not first observe the fruit? This is how consciousness begins examining itself. We need this question in our own awakening. Suppose someone sets a boundary and you immediately think they are disrespecting me. Ask, why did I interpret boundary as disrespect? Suppose someone disagrees with your teaching and you immediately feel they are attacking truth. Ask, why did disagreement become attack? Suppose your child questions you and you feel they are rebellious. Ask, why did questioning become rebellion in my mind? That is inner work. Maybe the answer is conditioning. Maybe in your childhood, disagreement was punished. Questioning was disrespect. Authority was absolute. So when someone questions you now, an old framework activates. You may be reacting to the past through the present. That is why reasoning must be examined. Sometimes the answer is ego. We may think, if I admit they have a point, I lose authority. Then reasoning begins defending status instead of seeking truth. That is dangerous. Because once ego becomes the client, intelligence can become its attorney. That is exactly why highly intelligent people can still rationalize harmful systems. Sometimes the answer is fear. If this interpretation is true, everything I built my identity on might have to change. So instead of observing, consciousness rejects. Again, the reasoning may sound theological, but fear may be underneath it. This does not mean every objection is fear. Important distinction. Some objections are valid. Some claims should be challenged. Some teachings are incoherent. Some leaders do abuse authority. Discernment absolutely requires questioning. The issue is not if you disagree, you are afraid. No. The issue is, can the question remain open enough to examine evidence, context, and fruit? That is healthy reasoning. Jesus brings the hidden reasoning into conscious awareness. That is what awakening does. Something we're doing automatically becomes visible. And once visible, we can choose differently. Before awareness, that's just how I am. After awareness, oh, I notice I become defensive whenever someone questions me. Now there is agency. Before, everyone always abandons me. After, I notice I interpret distance as abandonment very quickly. Now there is something to examine. Awareness creates room between stimulus and response. The paralytic is stuck in body, describes as stuck in conclusion. That contrast is striking. One cannot move physically. The others cannot move conceptually. One lies on a bed. The others sit inside an inherited framework, and Jesus addresses both. That means paralysis can take more than one form. Intellectual paralysis is real. A person may be highly educated and still unable to consider, maybe I need to revise my understanding. That is a kind of immobility. The mind has stopped moving. Not because it lacks information, because identity has become attached to the conclusion. This is why awakening requires intellectual humility. We must remain able to say, I know more than I knew before. And also, there is still more to see. That is the second touch again. No matter how much we understand, truth must remain larger than our current interpretation. Next, in their hearts. This phrase also reminds us that the heart, in biblical language, often reaches beyond emotion alone. It can point toward the inner center of thoughts, intent, desire, interpretation, and government. So the scribe's problem is not simply an intellectual technicality. Their inner government is involved. What we protect reveals what we worship. If I am willing to sacrifice truth to protect my doctrine, perhaps the doctrine has become the throne. If I am willing to sacrifice people to protect my authority, perhaps authority has become the throne. If I am willing to ignore fruit to preserve a title, perhaps the title has become the throne. That is what inner reasoning can reveal. Jesus does not humiliate them. Notice this too. He asks a question. Again, correction without unnecessary humiliation. He could have publicly mocked them. Instead, why reason ye these things in your hearts? That invites self-examination. The Jesus office exposes without needing ego theater. Healthy correction does not need to make the other person small. That is important. You can challenge someone's reasoning firmly and still preserve dignity. For example, I understand why you reached that conclusion, but can we examine whether the evidence actually supports it? That is very different from only an idiot will think that. One invites growth, the other protects ego. The friends and the scribes now represent two different uses of thought. The friends encountered a problem, door blocked. Their reasoning asked, how can we create access? The scribes encountered a restorative statement, thy sins be forgiven thee. Their reasoning asked, how can this fit within our fixed category? One kind of reasoning opens roofs, the other builds ceilings. That is a powerful contrast. Awakening needs roof-opening reasoning. Reasoning that asks, what have we overlooked? Is there another way to see this? Does the larger context clarify it? What fruit follows? Could my framework be too small? That is reasoning serving truth. Not reasoning that says, my framework is the measure of truth. Because then, anything larger than the framework will automatically be called dangerous. That is how people can defend inherited error with tremendous intelligence. Why reason ye these things? Jesus is asking them to examine the assumption beneath their theology. They concluded, only God forgives. Then, therefore, this man's statement is blasphemy. But what if the missing possibility is God's nature can be expressed through a human vessel aligned with that nature? Their reasoning did not include that category. So the question opens space for expansion. This is how revelation often works. It does not always erase what we knew. It exposes the assumption we added to what we knew. They may correctly hold forgiveness belongs to God. But perhaps they added, and therefore, forgiveness cannot be embodied through a human expression. That second piece needs examination. Awakening often separates truth, text, from assumption. That is huge. We should constantly ask, what does the text actually say? And what did I add because I was taught to assume it? Those are not always the same thing. That is where many breakthroughs happen. When you choose to start searching the scriptures for yourself, you start noticing things. You start seeing contradictions. Verse 9. Whether is it easier to say to the sick of the palsy, thy sins be forgiven thee, or to say, arise and take up thy bed and walk? Now Jesus does something brilliant. The scribes have challenged the statement, thy sins be forgiven thee. Why? Because forgiveness is invisible. You cannot look at someone and physically see, there, forgiveness just happened. So Jesus gives them another statement, arise and take up thy bed and walk. That one can be tested visibly. Either the man rises or he does not. And this brings us to a powerful awakening principle. Invisible truth should eventually produce observable fruit. Not necessarily spectacle, but transformation. Whether is it easier to say? Jesus turns the scribes' reasoning back toward them. They have been reasoning in their hearts. Now he gives them something to reason about. He does not tell them, stop thinking. He gives their thinking a better question. Healthy truth does not fear examination. It can say, observe what happens. Forgiveness is invisible. If Jesus says, thy sins be forgiven thee, the scribes can object indefinitely. How would they know? There is no immediate outward measurement, but rise and walk creates visible evidence. The man's relationship to his condition would change before their eyes. That is why the next movement is so important. This connects directly with the fruit test. We have repeatedly said, do not merely listen to claims, observe fruit. Someone says, I have awakened. Fine. But what does that awakening produce? more humility, more discernment, more responsibility, more compassion, more agency, or more ego, more superiority, more dependence, more fear. The invisible claim is tested through visible fruit. Someone says, I have forgiven. Then we observe. Does that mean they no longer live consumed by revenge? Can they maintain a boundary without needing to destroy the other person's humanity? Can they speak about what happened truthfully without allowing it to govern every present decision? That may reveal something about whether forgiveness has become embodied. Someone says, I believe in love. What does love look like when the child makes a mistake? What does it look like when the spouse disagrees? What does it look like when someone says no? Invisible principle, visible fruit. Thy sins be forgiven thee. We establish that within our symbolic reading, this can point toward release from misalignment, condemnation, guilt that has become identity, a past that continues governing the present. Then Jesus puts beside it, arise. That means release is not meant to remain merely conceptual. It should make movement possible. Forgiveness that never changed the relationship to the past may still need embodiment. Someone can say, I forgive myself, but still spend every day saying, I am worthless because of what I did. The words of release have been spoken, but consciousness is still lying on the bed. That does not mean the person is honest. It may mean the truth has not yet become fully embodied. The invisible must eventually reach the legs. That is the symbolic beauty here. If I have genuinely begun receiving, my past does not have to permanently condemn me. Then eventually, something should begin changing in how I choose, how I speak, how I relate, how I move, how I see myself. Forgiveness begins becoming walking. Or to say, arise. Now we get our first movement word, arise. To rise means leaving the position that has defined the man throughout the story. Until now, he has been horizontal, carried, lowered, dependent upon others for physical movement. But truth is moving him toward vertical agency. That is powerful. Awakening is often a rising. You were beneath fear, shame, conditioning, dependency, and self-condemnation. Then something within begins saying, I do not have to remain here. Rise. Rising is not yet walking. Notice the sequence. First, arise. Then, take up thy bed. Then, walk. Again, restoration unfolds in stages. That is realistic. First, you stand. Sometimes, the first act of awakening is not changing your whole life. It is simply recognizing I have a choice. That is standing. You may not know the entire path yet, but you are no longer completely identified with immobility. Then you take up the bed. This is going to become one of the strongest symbols in the whole narrative because the bed has been carrying the man. Now Jesus says, you carry it. That is reversal of government. What once carried you becomes something you can carry. Your past once carried your identity. Now you can carry the memory without being governed by it. Fear once carried your decisions. Now fear may still arise, but you can hold it, observe it, and choose differently. The family pattern once carried your behavior automatically. Now you can recognize it and say, that was handed to me, but I do not have to reproduce it. You are carrying the bed. The bed is no longer carrying you. This is not erasing the past. The bed does not disappear. That matters. Jesus does not say, pretend you never had a bed. He says, take it up. That gives us a mature picture of healing. Healing does not always erase the history. It changes your relationship to the history. Your story can remain without remaining your prison. You may still remember what happened, what you did, what you survived, what you learned. But the memory becomes something you carry with wisdom, rather than something upon which your whole identity remains immobilized. That is transformation. And walk. Now agency becomes movement. Walking is lived embodiment. Not merely insight, not merely standing, but movement, direction, choice, and participation in life. The man is not told where every step must go. This is important. Jesus restores movement. He does not micromanage every future step. That again fits our agency framework beautifully. Truth does not say, now that I restored your movement, you must consult me before every tiny decision forever. The capacity is restored. The person walks. Healthy truth restores decision-making capacity. That is exactly what healthy parenting, teaching, counseling, mentoring, and community should eventually do. At first, someone may need guidance, but over time, the fruit should be, I can walk. Think about the friends. This becomes even more powerful now. They carried him into the encounter. But Jesus does not say, 4 friends, pick him up again. He speaks to the man, arise. The carrying stage has reached its limit. Now another stage begins. Healthy support knows when to stop carrying. This is difficult for helpers. Sometimes the person has grown, but the helper keeps carrying because being needed has become part of their identity. That can turn help into dependence. A healthy helper can recognize you can stand now and let them. Parents experience this. At one stage, hold the child's hand crossing the street. Later, teach them how to cross safely. Eventually, they cross without you. If the parent refuses to release capacity, love can become control. Teachers experience this. At first, let me show you the pattern. Later, what do you see? Eventually, the student teaches someone else. That is healthy multiplication. Counselors experience this. At first, a person needs help naming the pattern. Eventually, they begin saying, I noticed this trigger before I reacted. Now the person is walking. That should be celebrated. Whether is it easier? There is also something brilliant about Jesus' question. From the perspective of speech, both statements are easy to say. Anyone can say, you are forgiven. Anyone can say, walk. But what validates the office is not the impressive language. It is whether restoration follows. That is important. Anybody can speak spiritual language. Anyone can say, be healed, be free. I have revelation. But what does the teaching actually produce? Does it help people see clearly, take responsibility, regain agency, become less dependent, walk? That is the fruit test again. This protects us from charisma without substance. A person may sound powerful, use titles, speak dramatically, make extraordinary claims. But if people around them become more confused, more dependent, more frightened, more unable to think independently, something is wrong. The visible fruit matters. The Jesus office produces movement. That is the repeated pattern. The deaf hear. The bound tongue speaks plainly. The blind sees clearly. Peter walks on water. The frightened disciples learn to examine fear. The paralytic rises and walks. The fruit is increasing capacity, clarity, agency, embodiment. That consistency is important. Arise, take up thy bed and walk. This command contains 3 levels of restoration. Arise, change your position. Take up thy bed, change your relationship to what once carried you. Walk, begin living from restored agency. That is almost a complete awakening sequence in one sentence. Arise. I am not permanently defined by this condition. Take up thy bed. I can integrate my history without remaining governed by it. Walk. Now I embody what I have discovered. That is powerful. And this is why forgiveness comes first. Now the sequence makes even more sense. Jesus first says, Son, which is identity. Then thy sins be forgiven thee, which is release. Then he introduces arise, new position. Take up thy bed, new relationship to the past. Walk, new embodied life. Identity, to release, to agency, to integration, to embodiment. That is awakening. The scribes wanted to debate authority. Jesus moved toward demonstration. That is another beautiful contrast. They say, "Who can forgive?" Jesus essentially responds, "Then observe what restoration produces." Not because every truth must prove itself through dramatic physical events, but because the claim is going to have fruit in this narrative. That is the text's own logic. Sometimes, the best response to an argument is fruit. You do not have to convince everyone verbally. If someone says your boundaries are selfish, and over time, your life becomes more peaceful, more responsible, more loving, less resentful, the fruit speaks. If someone says thinking for yourself will destroy you, and you become more grounded, more compassionate, more discerning, more responsible, fruit. You do not have to return to the town to prove you can see. We already learned that. The blind man did not go back to demonstrate anything. He lived. Sometimes embodiment is the answer. This also keeps us humble. We do not need to announce, "My interpretation is definitely right." We can say, "Let us observe what it produces." Does it make scripture more coherent? Does it reflect source character? Does it restore agency? Does it reduce fear-based dependence? Does it make us more truthful, compassionate, and responsible? That's fruit. Verse 10. But that you may know that the Son of Man had power on earth to forgive sins. This verse is enormous within the framework we have been building. Because the scribes have just reasoned, who can forgive sins but God only? But Jesus does not respond by moving restoration further away from humanity. He says, that you may know that the Son of Man had power on earth to forgive sins. Notice the language. Son of Man, power on earth, forgive sins. Within our symbolic reading, this sounds like the restorative nature of the source becoming expressed through embodied human consciousness in lived human experience. Not truth remaining somewhere distant, truth becoming human action. Not forgiveness remaining an abstract divine concept, forgiveness becoming something embodied on earth. But that ye may know. Jesus wants something to become recognizable. The scribes are reasoning inwardly. They have a theological conclusion. Jesus now says essentially, let what follows gives you something to observe. Again, he does not forbid examination. He provides fruit. That fits our approach beautifully. Observe before you conclude. They have an invisible question. They cannot see forgiveness. They hear, thy sins be forgiven thee. But how can they verify what that release means? So Jesus connects invisible restoration with visible movement. The man is about to rise. The inward principle will produce outward fruit. That you may know. Not merely that you may believe because I demand it, but that you may know. Something is about to become observable. That is important. Healthy truth does not need to destroy our capacity to examine. It can invite us to look at what it produces. The Son of Man. Now, this phrase becomes especially important within our symbolic framework. We have been observing Son as expression, manifestation, and nature becoming visible, and man as embodied human consciousness or human expression. So symbolically, Son of Man can point us toward a principle becoming expressed through embodied humanity. That is beautiful here, because the scribes have just created a division: God over here, man over there, and forgiveness belongs only over there. But Jesus is showing them what happens when the nature associated with the source becomes embodied through human consciousness. The source does not need to stop being the source for humanity to reflect it. This is crucial. If God is love, human beings can love. That does not make the human being the origin of love. If God is truth, human beings can speak truth. That does not make the human being the source of truth. If God is compassion, human hands can become compassionate hands. If God is forgiveness, human consciousness can embody forgiveness. The source remains throne, the nature becomes expression. That is the sun pattern. The invisible becomes visible. The principle becomes action. The nature becomes fruit. And that is why titles alone are never enough. We ask, what is being expressed? If someone occupies the Jesus office, within our framework, we recognize that within our framework, recognize that office when someone has awakened to truth, embodied it, and begins reflecting it through compassion, integrity, discernment, courage, restoration, and agency. They are not claiming, I am the source. They are becoming an expression of what they have internalized. This makes the office available as a function. A mother may express the Jesus office when she chooses restoration instead of humiliation. A father may express it when he admits harm, apologizes, and changes. A counselor may express it when they help someone move from shame into responsible agency. A teacher may express it when they help a student see clearly without demanding dependence. A friend may express it when they bring someone toward truth and then allow them to encounter it for themselves. Different people, same source-aligned function. The office is recognized by fruit. And what fruit are we seeing here? The man came carried, immobilized, dependent. Jesus is moving him toward release, standing, carrying, and walking. That is restorative fruit. So the office becomes recognizable through what happens to the person encountering it. Next, have power. Now we come to power. And we need to be careful not to read power automatically as domination. Because look at how Jesus uses it. He does not use power to make the paralytic dependent. He uses power to restore his own power to move. That distinction is enormous. Source-aligned power restores power. That is a strong principle. And healthy power says, you need me because I am strong and you are weak. Healthy power says, let me use my strength to help restore your capacity. One produces dependency, the other produces agency. Jesus' power does not shrink the man. It enlarges his capacity. At the beginning, the man cannot move himself. At the end, he walks. So the power of the Jesus office is not measured by how helpless everyone becomes around him. It is measured by how much life, clarity, movement, and agency are restored. This gives us an excellent test for leadership. If someone's power consistently makes everybody around them afraid to think, afraid to question, unable to decide, dependent upon their approval, then we should question what kind of power is operating. But if someone's influence helps people become clearer, more responsible, more discerning, more capable, more truthful, more able to stand, that resembles the rhetoric pattern we are seeing here. Power that creates permanent dependence is suspicious. Because Jesus is about to say, arise. Not stay laying there so everyone can keep admiring my power. That is huge. A controlling teacher needs you to remain on the bed because your dependence proves their importance. The Jesus office wants you walking. On earth, this phrase may be one of the most important parts of the verse. Because within our framework, heaven can represent higher understanding. Earth can represent lived human experience, the place where principles become embodied. So forgiveness is not being presented merely as something distant or theoretical. It becomes operative on earth, in relationships, in families, in communities, in consciousness, in actual human life. Heaven must become earth again. We keep seeing this pattern. Higher understanding cannot remain abstract. If I understand compassion in heaven, it must eventually become compassionate behavior on earth. If I understand forgiveness conceptually, it must eventually change how I carry the past. If I understand truth, it must eventually affect how I speak. If I understand agency, it must eventually affect how I choose. The invisible becomes visible. On earth makes forgiveness practical. Forgiveness is not merely one day, somewhere else, everything will be okay. It can become something we embody now. A parent can say, I will not keep using your old mistake against you after you have taken responsibility and changed. That is on earth. A spouse can say, we need repair, but I will not use forgiveness as manipulation. That is on earth. A person can say, I acknowledge what I did, make amends where possible, learn from it, and stop condemning myself forever. That is on earth. This does not mean forgiveness erases accountability. Again, we must maintain the distinction. Forgiveness aligned with truth does not say nothing mattered, because that will not be truth. Instead, name what happened. Take responsibility. Repair where possible. Learn. Release permanent condemnation, then walk differently. That is restorative forgiveness. The Jesus office does not forgive the man into the same condition. This is important. Forgiveness is followed by transformation. If forgiveness simply meant remain exactly as you are forever and nothing matters, then the story would end at verse 5. But it does not. Forgiveness prepares the ground for arise. That means release and responsibility belong together. Forgiveness removes the chain. Walking reveals the new government. This may be the pattern. The past loses its authority to immobilize. Then the person begins acting differently. That is how forgiveness becomes embodied. Think about someone who hurt their family through control. They awaken and realize, I dominated everyone. Forgiveness does not mean, well, forget it. It may mean, acknowledge it, apologize, stop controlling, learn to listen, respect boundaries. Then the person works differently. That is visible fruit. Or someone who abandoned their own voice for years. They realize, I kept saying yes when I meant no. They can forgive themselves for operating from fear. But forgiveness should eventually become, no, I disagree. I need time. That does not work for me. That is walking. The invisible release becomes visible expression. That is exactly why verse 9 and verse 10 belong together. Jesus says, which is easier, forgiving or rise and walk? Then, that ye may know. He connects the two. The visible movement becomes a witness to the restorative principle. This is why fruit matters so much in our framework. If someone tells us, I have encountered truth, the most interesting question becomes, what is that encounter producing? Are they becoming kinder without becoming passive? Stronger without becoming controlling? More discerning without becoming condemning? More independent without becoming isolated? More truthful without becoming cruel? That is embodiment. Son of Man also protects us from making awakening inhuman. This is important. Sometimes, spiritual language can make awakening sound like escaping humanity. But this verse says, Son of Man. Human expression matters. Embodiment matters. Earth matters. The goal is not to become less human. It is to become a more truthful, compassionate, and responsible expression within human life. Awakening should make us better at being human, better listeners, better parents, better friends, better leaders, better at repair, better at boundaries, better at using power responsibly, better at admitting when we are wrong, better at helping without controlling. That is truth becoming earthly fruit. The Jesus office is human truth in motion. Not merely knowing forgiveness is good, but embodying release. Not merely knowing agency malice, but restoring someone's ability to choose. Not merely saying love people, but using power in a way that gives them their legs back. That is profound. And notice the irony. The scribes worry that Jesus is taking something from God. But the fruit of Jesus' action is to give something back to the man. His movement, his dignity, his capacity, his future. That sounds much more like reflection than theft. He is not holding divine authority. He is expressing restorative nature. Source-aligned power gives. Egoic power accumulates. That is another useful distinction. Ego says, look how much authority I have. Source-aligned power says, rise. Ego says, remember who healed you. Truth says, take up your bed and go. The person becomes freer after the encounter. That is the fruit. Everyone aligned with restoration is working toward the same goal. The friends carry temporarily. The Jesus office releases and restores. The man eventually rises and walks. No one needs to remain the center. The purpose is life. That you may know. So what are the scribes being invited to know? Not merely Jesus can say a special phrase. They are being invited to observe a principle. The restorative nature they associate with God is becoming operative through embodied human expression, and the fruit will be visible in a human life. That is huge. This is why the next verse cannot be separated from this one. Verse 10 ends with Jesus turning back to the paralytic. Then verse 11 gives the command, I say unto thee, arise and take up thy bed and go thy way into thine house. There it is. And notice something we have not yet explored fully. Go thy way into thy house. That is going to matter. Because the man is not told, remain here in this spiritual environment forever. He is restored and then sent back into his own house, his own life, his own sphere. Again, no dependency, no permanent attachment to the healing environment. Truth restores him and releases him back into his own life. Mark 2:11, I say unto thee, arise and take up thy bed and go thy way into thine house. Now the restoration becomes visible. Up to this point, Jesus has spoken identity, son, release, thy sins be forgiven thee. And now he gives the man movement, arise, take up thy bed, go thy way into thine house. This is one of the clearest pictures we have seen of what source-aligned power actually does. It does not make the man more dependent. It makes him more capable. The man arrived being carried by 4 people. Now truth addresses him directly and says essentially, you can stand now. You can carry what once carried you. You can move under your own agency. You can return to your own life. That is liberation. I say unto thee. Jesus speaks directly to the man, not to the friends, not to the scribes, not to the crowd, but to thee. That matters. The friends brought him. Their faith helped create access. But now, the man's movement is his own. This is exactly the distinction we have been building. Healthy support can bring someone into an encounter. But eventually, truth must become personal. The friends cannot rise for him. They cannot take up his bed for him now. They cannot work for him. They have reached the limit of their function, and that is not failure. That is success. They helped him get to the point where he can hear, arise. Now their carrying is no longer necessary. Healthy helpers must know when the assignment changes. This is so important. At one stage, carry. At another, stand beside. At another, step back. If helpers do not adjust when capacity changes, support can quietly become control. A parent may need to make decisions for a very young child. But if that same parent refuses to release decision making as the child matures, the help has changed function. A counselor may initially give more structure. Later, the person should increasingly make their own judgments. A teacher may explain everything at first. Eventually, the student should begin seeing patterns without being given every answer. Healthy support evolves with restored capacity. Next, arise. This is the first command. Rise. Change position. The man has spent the entire story lying down. He has been carried, lowered, placed before Jesus. But now truth calls him into a new posture. That is awakening. Rising is a change of government. When you are lying on the bed holds you. When you rise, your own legs begin holding you. That is a reversal. Symbolically, what once governed you no longer has to govern you. Shame said, stay down. Truth says, arise. Fear said, you cannot do this. Truth says, arise. Conditioning said, this is just who you are. Truth says, arise. The old identity says, you are still the person you used to be. Truth says, arise. That is the voice of restored possibility. But notice, arise requires participation. Jesus gives the command, the man must respond. This is crucial. Truth does not erase agency, it activates it. That means awakening is not passive. At some point, the person must participate in their own restoration. Nobody can embody your boundary for you. Someone can help you understand that you need one, but eventually you say no. Nobody can use your voice for you forever. Someone can encourage you, practice with you, stand beside you, but eventually you speak. Nobody can forgive for you. They can model it, explain it, support you, but eventually you decide what you will carry. That is arise. Next, take up thy bed. Now read the extraordinary reversal. At the beginning of the story, the bed is carrying the man's condition. He lies on it. Others carry him and the bed together. Now Jesus says, take it up. The relationship has reversed. What once carried him, he now carries. The bed does not disappear, but its authority changes. That gives us a very mature picture of healing. Healing does not always erase the past. Sometimes, healing changes your relationship to it. The history remains. The memory remains. The scar may remain. The lesson remains. But it no longer dictates your movement. You carry the story. The story no longer carries you. This is different from pretending nothing happened. The man does not leave the bed behind pretending, I was never paralyzed. He takes it with him. That is integration. You can say, yes, this happened to me. Without, this is still who I am. You can say, yes, I once operated from fear. Without, therefore, fear must forever govern me. You can say, yes, I made that mistake. Without, therefore, that mistake owns my identity. That is carrying the bed. The bed becomes evidence instead of prison. What once represented limitation can later become evidence of transformation. You can look back and say, I remember when I could not speak. I remember when I thought I could never leave. I remember when I needed someone else to make every decision. I remember when guilt kept me immobile, not with shame, with recognition. I no longer live there. This is why testimony can be healthy when it does not become identity. There is a difference between this is what I came through and my whole identity is what happened to me. One carries the bed, the other is still lying on it. That distinction is powerful. Take up thy bed. This can also symbolize responsibility. The thing that once required others to carry now becomes his responsibility to manage. Restoration does not mean everyone else must continue handling everything for me. It gives him capacity. Now you carry it. That is agency with responsibility. Freedom and responsibility belong together. If we talk about agency without responsibility, we can become self-centered. Restored agency says, my life is mine, and also, therefore, my choices are mine to steward. That is mature freedom. Go thy way. Now this is powerful. Jesus does not say, go the way I choose for you every minute. He says, go thy way. There is restored direction. The man has a way, a path, a life, and he is being released into it. That is the opposite of spiritual control. A controlling spiritual system says, now that you have encountered truth, you must surrender every decision to us. The Jesus office says, go thy way. That does not mean truth no longer matters. It means the person now carries enough restored capacity to move in their own sphere. Truth returns the person to their own life. That is such a consistent pattern. The blind man was told to go to his house. The paralytic is told, go thy way into thy house. The encounter is not designed to create permanent dependence upon the encounter site. That is huge. A healthy healing environment should not need to keep you forever. There may be community, relationship, continued learning, but the goal is not stay here because you cannot function anywhere else. The goal is take what you have embodied into your actual life. That is where truth becomes earth. Into thine house. Again, his house, his sphere, his life, his relationships, his responsibilities. He was brought into someone else's house because truth was there. Now he is restored and sent back into his own. That is a beautiful reversal. He entered another house dependent. He returns to his own house capable. That is the full arc. He enters carried. He leaves walking. He enters on a bed. He leaves carrying the bed. He enters dependent upon 4 people. He leaves moving under his own agency. That is restoration. This is what healthy teaching should produce. You come into a teaching space needing help seeing. You leave better able to see for yourself. You come needing someone to interpret every symbol. You leave beginning to recognize the pattern. You come afraid to question. You leave able to observe carefully. You come dependent on a teacher. You live with stronger discernment. That is go thy way into thine house. The teaching must eventually enter the home. This is where embodiment becomes practical. It is not enough to understand love is important. What happens in your house? Do you humiliate your children? Do you apologize? Can people say no? Can someone disagree without fear? Truth must enter the house. Forgiveness must enter the house. If you say, I believe in forgiveness, but every family conflict revives every mistake anyone ever made, then forgiveness has not fully entered the house. Agency must enter the house. If you teach, everyone has freedom, but your spouse cannot make a decision without punishment, agency has not entered the house. Truth must enter the house. If you preach honesty publicly, but hide, manipulate, and control privately, truth has not become embodied where it matters most. So Jesus sends him home. That is where restoration gets tested. The house is where the new walking becomes ordinary. The dramatic encounter happened here, but the everyday embodiment happens there, at home. That is important. Awakening is not sustained only by peak experiences. It becomes real in ordinary life. The man will have to walk tomorrow too, not just in front of the crowd. He will have to wake up, stand, move, live, carry responsibility. The miracle becomes a new way of being, That is embodiment. This is why go thy way matters. He is not told to remain performing the miracle for everyone. He is told, leave. That echoes the blind man beautifully. You do not need to keep proving your healing. You can go home. The best evidence may be your life, not an argument, not endless explanation, not returning to everyone who doubted you. Walk. That is enough. The friends must now release him. This part is important too. Imagine if the 4 friends said, no, we carried you here, so we are carrying you home too. But the man can walk now. At that point, carrying will no longer be help. It will be interference. That is a subtle line every helper must learn. What was loving yesterday can become controlling tomorrow because capacity changes. Yesterday, let me carry this for you. Today, I trust you to carry it. That is mature love. Parents need to understand this. The child who once needed every decision made for them eventually needs room to make decisions. The parent's role moves from control to guidance to consultation. If the parent keeps treating the adult child as incapable, the bed may be gone. But the family keeps trying to put them back on it. That is not restoration. Communities can do this too. Someone begins healing. The community helps them through crisis. Later, they begin making independent choices. If the community becomes threatened by that independence, perhaps it wanted dependence more than restoration. Healthy community celebrates you are walking. Next, go thy way. There is dignity in this language. The man is not merely an object of charity anymore. He has direction. He has responsibility. He has movement. He has a life to return to. That is personhood restored. The paralysis never was his identity. And now, the narrative makes that visible. If paralysis had been his essence, he could not rise beyond it. But it was a condition. The condition changes, the person remains. That is why we must never reduce people to their trauma, their mistake, their diagnosis, their fear, their season, their worst behavior. See every man clearly. Arise also means the old label must lose authority. Everyone in the room knew him as the man who could not walk. But once he stands, the label becomes outdated. That is important. People may keep relating to you according to an old version of you. But their outdated perception does not have to become your current identity. Someone may still remember who you were. Let them remember. You do not have to climb back onto the bed to make their memory comfortable. You are allowed to outgrow other people's categories. You were once fearful, dependent, silent, reactive. People may still expect that version, but if you have developed, walk. You do not owe anyone continued paralysis because they became accustomed to carrying you. Sometimes, people benefit from your weakness. Your growth changes the relationship. That can make them uncomfortable. Still arise. The entire verse is about agency. Look at the verbs. Arise, you take up, you go. Truth calls the person into participation. That is so important. The Jesus office does not do every movement for him. It restores the capacity and calls him to use it. Source-aligned power produces more human agency, not less. That may be the governing principle of the whole paralytic narrative. The friends use their strength to help him reach truth. Truth uses its power to restore his strength. Then everyone gets out of the center and the man walks. Verse 12, and immediately he arose, took up the bed, and went forth before them all, insomuch that they were all amazed, and glorified God, saying, we never saw it on this fashion. Now the entire narrative comes together. The man does exactly what Jesus told him to do. He does not remain lying there, discussing whether he has been restored. He does not wait for his 4 friends to pick him back up. He does not ask the crowd whether they believe he can walk. He does not remain dependent upon Jesus. He arose, took up the bed, went forth. And most importantly, he went forth under his own restored agency. The friends carried him into the house, but nobody carries him out. That is the fruit. And immediately he arose. The command has now become embodiment. Jesus said, arise. The man responds, he arose. Truth has moved from word to action. This is what we're observing in verse 9. An invisible resurrective principle has become visible fruit. He does not merely agree with the teaching. Imagine if he said, I really believe what Jesus said about rising, and continue lying on the bed. The understanding will still need embodiment. Instead, he participates. He stands. That is awakening, becoming lived experience. This is where agency matters. Jesus does not physically lift him up. The friends do not lift him. The man rises. That is significant. The Jesus office has not replaced his agency. It has called his agency back into use. This is the same pattern we keep seeing. Truth does not say, I will forever do for you what you're capable of doing for yourself. Truth says, you can move now, and the person moves. Sometimes, the next stage of healing is participation. Someone may help you see you have a voice, but then you must speak. Someone may help you understand you are allowed to establish a boundary, but then you must establish it. Someone may tell you, you do not have to remain defined by your past, but eventually, you must begin making decisions from the new understanding that is rising. He took up the bed, and there is a reversal. At the beginning, the bed carried him. More precisely, his friends carried him on the bed. Now he carries the bed. The object has not disappeared. The relationship to it has changed. This is one of the strongest images of restoration in the entire narrative. What once carried him is now under his government. That is awakening. Fear once carried your decisions. Now fear may still disappear, but it does not decide where you go. You carry awareness of it. It does not carry your life. The past once carried your identity. Now you remember the past without living inside it. You carry the story. The story no longer carries you. Conditioning once determines your behavior automatically. Now, you recognize the conditioning and choose differently. You carry the understanding. The conditioning no longer carries your actions. The bed was not destroyed. And I think that is important. Jesus does not burn it. He does not make it disappear. The man takes it with him. That gives us such a mature picture of healing. Sometimes, restoration is not, I have no memory of what happened. It is what happened no longer determines how I move. You can carry the scar without living in the wound. You can remember, I was once afraid to speak without becoming the silent person again. You can remember, I once allowed people to cross every boundary without returning to that life. You can remember, I once harmed people because I did not understand what I was doing. Without spending the rest of your life immobilized by shame, the bed becomes part of the story, not the throne. And this changes the meaning of testimony. A healthy testimony is not look how damaged I am forever. It can become, look at what I learned to carry. The history remains, but there is new government. That is restoration. Next, and went forth. He leaves. This matters tremendously. He does not remain in the house. The restoration environment is not turned into a permanent residence. Jesus had told him, go thy way into thine house, and now he goes. Truth releases him. This is one of the clearest tests of the Jesus office. After encountering embodied truth, the man becomes less dependent, not more. He can leave. That is huge. A manipulative system says, you experience something here, therefore you belong to us now. The Jesus office says, go, return to your life, use what has been restored. Imagine if Jesus has said, now that I healed you, you need to remain beside me forever. That would change the whole function of the story, but he does not. The man is restored into his own life. This is why our office framework has to preserve agency. The true messenger does not create unnecessary dependency on the messenger. The friends must let him live too. Think about this. These 4 people have invested effort. They carried him, climbed the house, opened the roof, lowered him. But now their friend gets up and walks away. That is their success. They should not feel he doesn't need us anymore. They should be able to recognize the reason we carried him was so that he could walk. That is healthy love. Sometimes, helpers struggle with the success of their own help because being needed can become part of identity. A parent may say they want their child independent, then feel rejected when the adult child begins making independent decisions. A mentor may say they want a student to grow, then feel threatened when the student develops their own insight. A spiritual leader may say they want people awakened, then become uncomfortable when those people start discerning for themselves. But if restoration was truly the goal, walking should be celebrated. Do not put someone back on the bed because you miss carrying them. That may be one of the most important relational lessons in this passage. If they can walk now, let them walk. If they can decide, let them decide. If they can think, let them think. If they can speak, let them speak. That is development. Before them all. Now the restoration becomes publicly observable. This is interesting because we have seen other narratives where privacy was emphasized. The deaf man was taken aside. The blind man was told not to return to the town. Here, however, the man walks out before them all. Again, context matters. We cannot make one rigid formula out of every healing story. Sometimes, restoration needs privacy. Sometimes, fruit becomes publicly visible. The principle is not always hide or always testify. The principle is discernment. The deaf man's restoration required protection from spectacle. The blind man's boundary required not returning to prove anything. Here, the man must physically leave a crowded house. His walking is naturally going to be visible, so the text allows the fruit to speak for itself. He is not standing up saying, "Everybody, look at me." He simply obeys. And because he obeys, people see. That is very different from performance. He is not proving anything. He is living the restoration. That distinction matters. He does not return to the scribes an argument. He does not debate. See, Jesus was right and you were wrong. He simply rises, carries, walks, and sometimes that is the strongest answer. Fruit can answer what argument cannot. The scribes asked, "Who can forgive sins but God only?" Jesus could have entered an endless theological debate. Instead, the man's life becomes part of the answer. The formerly immobilized person is now moving. The invisible release has produced visible restoration. That does not mean every theological question is settled merely by an outcome. But within this narrative, Mark intentionally links the claim with fruit. This is why embodiment is so powerful. Someone may argue boundaries will make you bitter, but over time, you become more peaceful, more compassionate, less resentful, more capable of loving without self-betrayal. That's the fruit. Someone says, if you stop depending on us, you'll fall apart. But you begin making thoughtful decisions and growing. That's the fruit. Someone says, questioning will destroy your faith. But careful observation makes you more truthful, compassionate, coherent, and responsible. That's the fruit. Sometimes you do not need to fight everybody. Just walk. Next, they were all amazed. The crowd's perception changes. Remember earlier, the crowd was actually part of the access problem. They filled the house, blocked the door. Now they witnessed what happened because the friends found another route. That is interesting. The people who unintentionally block someone from reaching truth end up seeing the fruit of what happened when access was created. That can itself become a lesson for the community. Perhaps the crowd needs awakening too. Not because they are evil, but because now they can see this person needed access were not providing. And when access was created, restoration followed. Healthy communities should learn from that. Instead of becoming defensive, how dare you open the roof? Perhaps the fruit should make them ask, what do we need to change? So people do not have to climb roofs to reach what is inside. That will mature institutional reflection. Imagine a community learning from the paralytic. Instead of merely celebrating a miracle, it could ask, why was the door inaccessible? Who else cannot get through? Who are we unintentionally excluding? What assumptions have we built around access? That is how one person's restoration can improve a whole system. Next, glorified God. This may be one of the most important details for our entire Jesus as Office framework. Look where the glory goes, to God, to the source. The fruit expressed through Jesus does not terminate in ego worship of the human vessel. The response points back towards source. That is exactly the distinction we have been building. The source remains the throne. Jesus embodies the restorative principle. The man experiences restoration. The people observe the fruit, and the glory returns to God. That protects the office beautifully. The Jesus office reflects the source. It does not replace the source. This is how I recognize healthy embodiment. A true messenger should leave people more aware of truth, love, wisdom, compassion, integrity, and the source. Not obsessed with the messenger's personality. If the whole spiritual system ends with look how great I am, something has become distorted. The best teacher eventually makes truth larger than the teacher. People should live saying, I see something. Not merely that teacher is amazing. The teacher can be appreciated, but the fruit should point beyond the vessel. They glorified God. So the narrative itself preserves the order. Source, expression, restoration, human agency. That is beautiful. Source remains source. Jesus expresses. The man responds. The people recognize. The glory returns to source. No one needs to steal another office. This also protects the restored man from becoming the spectacle. The crowd does not ultimately glorify the paralytic either. His restoration points beyond him. That means even our transformation does not need to become ego. We can say, look what I have learned, without, therefore, I am better than everyone who is still struggling. No. Remember, you were carried once too. That should produce humility. The person who walks today may have needed 4 people yesterday. That is why awakened people should never mock those still on beds. You may be walking now. Remember when you could not. You may understand the pattern now. Remember when you could not see it. You may have a voice now. Remember when fear bound your tongue. That memory should increase compassion. Perhaps one day, the paralytic becomes a career. Restored people often become capable of helping others. The person who once needed support may later be able to say, I know what it feels like to be unable to move. Let me help you reach support. That is how restoration multiplies without creating hierarchy. Yesterday, carried. Today, walking. Tomorrow, perhaps, able to help someone else. That is development. Next, saying, we never saw it on this fashion. Now the crowd says something fascinating. We never saw it on this fashion. In other words, we have never seen it like this. This is a perception statement. Something has expanded their category. What they just witnessed does not fit the framework they had before. And that connects briefly to the scribes. The scribes had a category, God forgives, and this man cannot speak forgiveness. But now something happens that their previous framework did not fully account for. A man arrives unable to walk. He is called son, released, told to rise, and he walks out carrying his own bed. The crowd says, we have never seen it this way before. That is precisely what revelation can feel like. New sight often sounds like, how did I never notice this? I have read this story for years. I never saw the pattern. This makes so much sense now. That is, we never saw it on this fashion. Not necessarily because the text changed, because perception changed. And this is why we must remain teachable. The moment we decide, there is no other way for me to say this, we may become the scribes, sitting in the room, protecting the ceiling. But awakening says, I know what I presently see, and truth is still larger than my current sight. That keeps the roof open. Sometimes, revelation does not contradict everything we knew. It reorganizes it. The crowd already knew God, forgiveness, healing, and scripture. But now, these ideas are being connected in a form they had not seen before. That is often how awakening works. Not always replacing every piece. Sometimes even the pattern connecting the pieces. Look at the entire narrative now. It begins, truth is in the house. Word spreads. People gather, but access becomes blocked. Then a paralyzed man appears. 4 friends lend their strength. The normal doorway does not accommodate him. They refuse to give up. They open the roof. They lower him toward truth. Then the friend's row recedes. Jesus speaks directly to the man, son. Identity restored. Thy sins be forgiven thee. Burden released. The scribes resist. Their reasoning is exposed. Jesus connects invisible release with visible fruit. Then arise. Position changes. Take up thy bed. Relationship to the former condition changes. Go thy way. Agency returns into thy house. Truth returns the person to their own life. And now he rises, carries the bed, walks out. The crowd sees and glorifies God. That is an incredibly coherent awakening map. And look at the transformation in agency. Beginning of the story, he cannot reach the house himself. Others carry him. In the middle, others must even lower him into the encounter. Then truth addresses him directly. In the end, nobody carries him. Nobody moves him. Nobody takes his bed. Nobody chooses his direction. He walks. That progression tells us exactly what healthy restoration should produce. Messenger to encounter to agency. That may be the simplest structure. The friends function as messengers and facilitators. They bring him toward encounter. The Jesus office embodies restorative truth. Then the man's own agency is restored. The messenger does not become the destination. The encounter does not create permanent dependency. The fruit is a human being capable of working for himself. That is also the standard we can apply to our own teaching. If we are genuinely helping people awaken, eventually, they should become better able to read, observe, discern, question, compare, recognize patterns, make responsible choices. They should not need to ask us what every single verse means forever. At some point, they begin saying, wait, I see it. That is the person rising. The goal is not to collect bets around the teacher. A spiritually unhealthy system can become a room filled with people who remain dependent while the leader continually demonstrates how necessary they are. But the Jesus office creates the opposite scene. People live with their beds. The room becomes emptier because restored people can go live. That is beautiful. And that brings us to the end of the teaching. Have a good night.